talk about the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. In this part, we'll see only about the frontal lobe. So this is the frontal lobe, as you can see, and it has 5 important areas of the frontal lobe. We have to study each of them in detail. That's the only thing we have to do about the frontal lobe. All right. So first of all, let us see the boundaries of the frontal lobe. So as you can see, there is one boundary located here and the other one is located here. This boundary is called the central sulcus. You must be knowing it about the brain, that it has a deep groove like structure called the central sulcus, and this boundary is the sylvian fissure, which is also called the lateral sulcus. This you have to remember, the boundaries of the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. All right, so let's move on to the major areas. This area, as you can see, which is in red color, it's called the primary motor cortex. All right, the second one is called the motor association cortex. This one, which is present in blue, is called the motor association cortex, and it is made up of 2 parts, which is called the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor cortex. All right, the motor association cortex is made up of 2 parts, the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor cortex. The third part, which you can see in green color, is the frontal eye field. All right, this one you have to remember that it is called the frontal eye field. We'll be talking about it later. And then the one which you are seeing in dark blue color, this one, the bigger one, is called the prefrontal cortex. All right, and the one in the brown color, this small area which is located below all these, is called the Broca sensory area. One thing that you need to know, that these are located on both the sides. We are able to see the brain only from one side, but these areas are located on the other hemisphere also. So all of these areas are present on both the sides of the brain, that is in both the cerebral hemispheres. So now let's briefly take a insight of what are the functions of these areas. The primary motor cortex is responsible for voluntary movements. The motor association cortex, as we already talked, that it is made up of 2 parts, premotor cortex and the supplementary motor cortex. It is responsible for planning, sequence and execution of movements. Next is the frontal eye field. It is responsible for voluntary rapid eye movements. We'll talk about the mechanism later on. The prefrontal cortex is the 4th part, which is responsible for memory and learning, all that other cognitive activities, motor planning and personality and behavior. And the 5th part, Broca's areas, is involved in the muscles which help us to produce speech. And in right-handed people, it is located on the left frontal lobe, and in left-handed people, it is located on the right-handed lobe. Broca's area is only one. It is not present in both of the central cerebral hemispheres. All right, as I told you before. So now let us dig into it and see the details of each of the areas of the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. So first of all, we have the primary motor cortex, which is located here, as we have already seen. The other name of primary motor cortex is this. You have to just remember that it is also called Brodmann's areas 4. You have to remember this. We have already seen that its major function is voluntary motor movements. So let us see how it controls. So there is a tract of nerve fibers which passes from the primary motor cortex. As you can see, this is the ganglion of cells, and it passes downwards. It has 2 areas, or we can say tracts. This upper one is called the corticobulbar tract, and the lower one is called the corticospinal tract. All right, the neurons in the corticobulbar tract supply to the cranial nerves. As you can see, this first one supplies to the trigeminal nerve, which is the 5th cranial nerve. The second one supplies to the facial nerve, which is the 7th cranial nerve. This third one supplies to this bunch of cranial nerves, the 9th, the 10th and the 11th, and the last one, hypoglossal nerve, which is the 12th cranial nerve. You might be already knowing this. And the area which is located below is the corticospinal tract, and it collectively supplies to the muscles of the limbs and the trunks. So in this way, it controls the voluntary motor movements of our body. So now let us talk about the somatotopy of this area. That is, we are going to see the structural organization of this area. We are seeing, what you are seeing right now is the coronal section of the brain. That is, we are observing it from the front side or the back side after cutting it. All right, so as I already told you that these are located on both the cerebral hemispheres. So these areas are located on both the cerebral hemispheres. The area of the prefrontal primary frontal cortex, which is located here, supplies to the nerves of the leg. This region supplies to the hand, this region supplies to the face, and this region supplies to the tongue and the region below it. Alright, so this is the basic organization, and this organization is called motor homunculus. Alright, you have to remember this name, that this organization of which area supplies where is called motor homunculus. This we are talking about the primary motor cortex. Alright, Now let us talk about the arteries which supplies this region. This artery which supplies this region, that is the region which is supplying to the leg portion more or less, is called the anterior cerebral artery. And this artery which is supplying to this region, to the hand and the face, all that thing, is called the middle cerebral artery. Alright. Any damage to the anterior cerebral artery can cause the paralysis of the lower extremity because it is supplying to the region from where the neurons are passing towards the leg. And any damage to the middle cerebral artery causes the damage to the upper extremity, as it is supplying to the region where the neurons are supplying to the hand. Alright, so these things you have to remember. Now let us move on to the second area, which is called the motor association cortex. It is composed of two parts. We've already talked about that, is the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor cortex, and it is also called Brodmann's area 6. This is an information you have to remember. You have to mark this up. It is involved in fine motor movement, and it also contributes some part to the corticospinal tract, which was being supplied by the primary motor cortex. This also contributes to some portion. We'll see in the diagram which follows here. See, this is the blue trunk which you are seeing is directly contributing to the same pathway which was being supplied by the primary motor cortex to the corticobulbar tracts and to the corticospinal tracts, but this only supplies to the corticospinal tract, as you are seeing here. This is the supplementary motor cortex. This is the motor association cortex, which is present below, and together this complete is called the motor association cortex, and this one which is present below is called the premotor cortex. So motor association cortex is made up of supplementary motor cortex and premotor cortex together. This area is very important as it is responsible for planning, sequence and execution of movements. We have already talked this function. Now let us see how this controls the planning, sequence and execution of movements. It has a lot of connections with the basal ganglia as well as the cerebellum of the brain. See, this is the basal ganglia. This is connected to the motor association cortex, as well as it has connections with the cerebellum. So together collectively with all these structures, it helps in planning, sequence and execution of movements. Now let us move on to the prefrontal cortex, which is here. We'll see the other cortex later, but now let us focus only on this prefrontal cortex. This is very important. It is also called Brodmann area 8 to 14. Any number which is present between 8 to 14 can be called as prefrontal cortex. Alright. Now let us talk about its functions. It is responsible for personality, behavior, working memory, cognition, as I already told you, reasoning, judgment, decision making, motor planning. All right, these are the main functions, but how does it perform all these important functions? So let us see. It has connections with hippocampus, hypothalamus, amygdala and ventral tegmental area, which is present in the midbrain. This ventral tegmental area is present in the midbrain, is responsible for a lot of things like thinking, reasoning, judgment, all that, planning, etc. It can also connect with the posterior association area for motor planning. This area is called the posterior association area. This is also connected to the prefrontal cortex, and all these hippocampus and amygdala, all these together, hypothalamus is located here. All these are also have connection with the prefrontal cortex. So together with these, collectively it is able to do all these important functions, which is personality, behavior, working memory, cognition, reasoning, judgment, decision making and motor planning. All right, now let us dig into the pretemporal dementia. This is a disease which is caused by the damage in both frontal lobe and temporal lobe. Now we'll only be focusing on the frontal part symptoms, because we are talking about the frontal lobe. We'll talk about the temporal lobe later. The patient becomes aggressive, hostile and irrational. He has memory loss, difficulty in learning because of the damage, because he is not able to perform all these basic important functions. Then he or she can also show inappropriate sexual behavior, or can be involved in gambling, and can have Parkinson's syndromes like symptoms. Now let us move to the frontal eye field. This is also very important. It is called Brodmann's area 8, and the mechanism here is very important. You have to understand the mechanism. Let us talk about it. It has connections with the cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve 6 and the PPRF, which is called the paramedian pontine reticular formation. You do not have to remember this full form, but you have to remember that it is connection with these three parts. So now let us talk about the mechanism. The right frontal eye, this is the right frontal eye field, this is the left frontal eye field. The right frontal eye field supplies to the left PPRF and the left frontal field similarly supplies to the right PPRF. All right. So now let us look only at this one. The right frontal eye field is supplying to the left PPRF, which in turn is supplies to the left cranial nerve 6. As we already talked that it supplies to the cranial nerve 6. All right. So left PPRF supplies to left cranial nerve 6, and this left cranial nerve 6 on one side supplies to the lateral rectus of the left eye and to the medial rectus of the right eye. And we already know that the lateral rectus is responsible for abducting the eye and the medial rectus is responsible for adducting the eye. All right. So this is abducting the eye, that is it moving away from the central line of the body. The eye shifts towards this side, and this medial rectus is responsible for adduction of the eye, that is it moving towards the central part of the body. So again the eye moves from this side. So eye will pull to left side. Overall both the eyes will pull to the left side. So the right frontal eye field was responsible for shifting both the eyes towards the left side. Similarly, the left frontal eye field will be responsible for shifting both the eyes towards the right side. So this is the mechanism. And if there is a damage or lesion to any part of the pathway, the eye will deviate to the same side in which there is the lesion. For example, the lesion is located on the right frontal eye field. All right, or damage is on the right frontal eye field. So the eye will not be able to move to this part, to the left, so it will automatically be moving towards the right direction. So that's what it says, that if there is a damage or lesion to any part of the pathway, the eye will deviate to the same side on which there is the lesion, and this condition is called ipsilateral conjugate gaze deviation. This you have to remember, ipsilateral conjugate gaze deviation. Now let us talk about the last area, which is the Broca's area. As we already seen, it stimulates the muscles of the speech and it communicates with Wernicke's areas, which is located in the temporal lobe. We'll talk about that later. Through the arcuate fasciculus. This is the structure through which both of these connect, Wernicke's areas and Broca's areas. It also contributes to the corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tracts, as same as the primary motor cortex and the motor association cortex. It supplies to the facial nerves, which stimulates the muscles called orbicularis oris. So the it supplies the facial nerve, which is responsible, which supplies this muscle called orbicularis oris. Now this muscle is responsible for changing the shape of the mouth. So there is a muscle called orbicularis oris, which is supplied by the facial nerve, which is responsible for changing the shape of the mouth during speech. That's why we say that the Broca's area is responsible for stimulating the muscles of speech. So this is the muscle orbicularis oris. It also supplies to the pharyngeal plexus, the area pharyngeal plexus, which supplies to the area of the soft palate. Now let us talk about a disease called the Broca's aphasia. It is basically the damage to the Broca's areas in which a person is not able to speak fluently. He or she is always grammatically incorrect, and you can see a lot of videos on Broca's aphasia which are present on YouTube. That is, the patients take a lot of time to frame words in their mind and they are not able to speak in flow. All right, so that is, they are non-fluent in speech, but their comprehension is intact. All right, so these are all the symptoms of Broca's aphasia. About the next this was all about the frontal lobe, and next we'll talk in the next lecture. Thank you.